This is understandable politics. Hello, the West is preparing a coup in Georgia. Many media outlets provided this analysis on the eve of the elections. It's quite strange, as it seemed the country was firmly on the European path. But what changed in such a short time? Why did Tbilisi suddenly turn from a friend into a regime unwanted by Europe? While the country's Central Election Commission is still counting the final numbers, we decided to review the events surrounding Georgia.
Why and how did they start destabilizing the country? What technologies were used? And who suggested Tbilisi start a war with Russia?
Molotov cocktails blaze on Rustaveli Avenue, the Ukrainian anthem is heard, and the opposition's demands grow exponentially. The destabilization began last spring. You might ask, what happened? It was enough for the local authorities to announce plans to adopt a law on transparency of foreign influence. Tbilisi, Batumi, Kutaisi tried to pressure the authorities as always through the streets. The U.S. added fuel to the fire, promising sanctions against those involved in suppressing protests, and the EU hinted at problems on the European path.
The EU ambassador to Georgia, Paweł Herczynski, called the Foreign Agent Bill incompatible with EU recommendations. In turn, U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price expressed the opinion that adopting the law could distance Georgia from integration into the Euro-Atlantic community, as it interferes with universal human rights. Moreover, Price stated that those responsible for suppressing protests in Georgia could face U.S. sanctions.
It quickly became clear that the protests were far from spontaneous, and we've seen all this before. Déjà vu in Georgian style looked very stereotypical. The organizers of yet another color revolution came up with nothing new. They took Sharp's very manual as a guide.
Of course, the plan to destabilize Georgia couldn't do without a series of symbolic actions, many of which are painfully familiar to Belarusians from August 2020. Thus, on March 8th, a women's march took place in Tbilisi. Yes, everything as always. Ladies resembling banshees from Celtic legend, slogans barely connected to reality. Another clear sign of deliberate destabilization was a video allegedly showing a security officer joining the protest. A standard move aimed at sowing discord among the military and police. And of course, there were incredible stories of hundreds of severely injured and police brutality.
Among the protest leaders was the United National Movement Party. Opposition forces were also supported by Georgian President Salome Zurabichvili and Western politicians.
The social base of the protest was, as always, the youth. The average age of most protesters barely exceeded 30 to 35 years.
An interesting point. Belarusian exiles actively engaged in covering events in Tbilisi. However, it seems they didn't receive clear instructions on whom to criticize or praise. Thus, admins from Maharsky channels who used derogatory epithets against Oman and Gubopek awkwardly referred to the Georgian police as security forces and the protesters as people. And that's it. No confrontation between enforcers and the incredible.
The foreign agent law was withdrawn from Parliament then, but later returned and passed this year.
On April 17, 2024, tens of thousands of people poured into the streets of Tbilisi. They protested against the bill on transparency of foreign influence. According to the opposition, it copies the Russian document and infringes on people's rights to freedom of speech and democracy.
The ruling party, Georgian Dream, proposed the bill. Its adoption seemed quite logical. In a country with a population of nearly 4 million, there are 25,000 NGOs. That's one organization per 148 people.
Consider that they have a very large network. Also, media organizations, opposition parties, the line between them is absolutely blurred. This is a powerful army trained by the fathers of these revolutions, Sharp and his disciple, who came here to conduct training. They all know perfectly well how it's done. The first color revolution, the Rose Revolution, was conducted here. Then the entire Georgian contingent was, so to speak, flown to Ukraine and helped Yushchenko win. And then the second time, where they carried out the Maidan, Euromaidan.
90% of non-profit organizations received money from abroad. Who gives for what? The state doesn't know. Hence, the understandable attempt to protect themselves.
The law merely requires NGOs to annually report their income and expenses, which is very close to the European directive adopted 3 months ago by the European Commission and submitted for approval to the European Parliament. Laws on transparency of foreign funding already exist in the US, Israel, and Australia, and in the EU and France. Such bills are under consideration. Meanwhile, the EU and individual EU countries, the US, the UN, NATO, and the Council of Europe have urged Georgia to abandon the adoption of this bill.
Belarusians don't need to be told that all these bright faces and NGO volunteers often herald uprisings, coups, and conflicts. Against this backdrop, the statement by the founder of the ruling party, Bidzina Ivanishvili, seems unsurprising. Western officials suggested the former Georgian Prime Minister start a war with Russia.
I can recall what former Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili told me. He was approached by a high-ranking official from one of the Western countries. Irakli asked, "Yes, but how do you imagine, how many days can we fight with Russia? How many days can we hold out?" He was told 3 to 4 days. He said, "And for these 3 to 4 days, you are destroying us." He was told, "Well, there are 3 to 4 million of you. Not everyone will be killed in 3 to 4 days. Then you can start a guerrilla movement in the forest. We will help you, and you will fight from there."
Much has mixed in the Georgian House, so much so that for Georgia, the current parliamentary elections are a Rubicon, after which the country will certainly not be the same, regardless of the outcome. Party programs, their rhetoric, and allies will tell better than any analyst where they are trying to steer the country. The very name Coalition for Change makes it clear these are pro-Western politicians. The first number is Nana Malashkia. Her achievements include waving the EU flag during a protest against the foreign agent law. Politicians of this wing speak of the inevitability of Georgia's path to the EU. In the election ballot, the coalition is listed under number 4. And this is important because the number 4 was used everywhere in their campaign. Even in the political program, this numerology continued.
The coalition program is called Plan 4.4.4. 4 days after forming a coalition government, if victorious, they plan to present the most important initiatives for changes in 4 areas. Namely, restoring Euro integration processes, initiating democratization processes such as repealing the foreign agent law, reducing taxes, and finally, significantly increasing the education budget.
The National Movement is the most popular opposition party in Georgia. It was founded in 2003 by a hero trader in one person, Mikhail Saakashvili.
The party's main card is the martyr figure of Saakashvili. The union decided to attract the electorate using the same methods as the changers. Leaflets imitate an EU passport, and all movements lead only to 2 letters, EU.
It's important to say that this is a serious political force. Before the elections, the party's rating reached up to 20%.
The party, by the way, has a peculiar ally, namely the Caucasian Legion, an extremist organization whose leader Ladogam Sakurdia fights on Ukraine's side even in the Kursk region. We well remember the experience of Georgian snipers from the Maidan.
Gamsakurdia, by the way, calls things by their names. His party is a power bloc, and its goal is to overthrow the government in Georgia through an armed rebellion. That is, if the ruling party wins, blood will be shed in the country, according to him.
It will be a revolution. The leader of the Unity of Georgia party, Lado Gamsakurdia, who fights on Ukraine's side, threatens a coup if the ruling Georgian Dream wins the parliamentary elections. He added that there's no need to resort to rhetoric like, "Why do we need brute force terrorism?" because that means surrendering without a fight. Gamsakhurdia fights in the Georgian Legion of Ukraine and participates in the invasion of the Kursk region by the Ukrainian armed forces. From mercenaries, he created a power bloc of his party, which will participate in the parliamentary elections.
When the West wants something, all resources are engaged. There's no limit to cunning and cynicism. The local parliament was stunned by what the West is capable of. The speaker stated that the opposition in Georgia has already prepared a coup scenario.
There are all signs of such a scenario. A pre-prepared technical government, local observers who actually have political goals in the elections, and their pre-prepared false conclusion about the elections.
It's time to talk about the Georgian dream, the ruling coalition. The party has been at the helm for the 13th year. Before the elections, they were supported by 60% of those surveyed.
The party is often accused of a pro-Russian course. The Dream initiated not only the aforementioned foreign agent law, but also a ban on LGBT propaganda. Carefully, proposals were made by deputies to enter into a confederation with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Tbilisi lost control over these territories decades ago.
And here, President of Georgia Zurabishvili appears in the narrative. A fierce opponent of the ruling party, she does everything to sabotage the parliament's work. The deputies responded by attempting impeachment twice.
She entertains herself by buying antiques, where, without consulting anyone, without government permission, which is a constitutional violation, she constantly spends state money on her overseas tours, where she urges Western and EU leaders to impose economic sanctions on Georgia and strangle it because it is allegedly run by a Russian oligarch, and who pardons people, as we know, not selflessly. She practically has no other functions and vetoes all bills proposed by Parliament.
And where would we be without Moldova's influence? After major problems on the Western Front, Dusandu and Zurabishvili became worried. By the way, the president of Georgia was born in Paris and openly declares her sympathies for her Moldovan colleague from the Euro incubator. And not only that,
After meeting with the French leader, Zurabishvili stated that she agreed with Collective Europe on a candidate for the prime minister's post, and she expects total support in this matter. Even Georgian opposition parties hastened to declare that they have nothing to do with such statements.
Mamuka Dinaradze stated that the authorities have information that opposition members plan to blackmail or bribe people involved in the electoral process at several polling stations, with a substantial sum to involve them in at least minor violations and manipulations. The goal is to film the violations they provoked and create a negative impression of the elections. Also, according to the politician, opposition members plan to overwhelm polling station workers with identical complaints, overload the CEC's communication channels, massively refuse to perform the functions of party members of precinct commissions, create artificial queues at polling stations, attempt to damage electronic vote counting devices, and simulate carousels.
in general, Georgia has become quite audacious in the eyes of the West. They adopted the foreign agent law, another document even encroached on the sacred. They decided to ban LGBT propaganda, and overall, they started defending their interests at an inconvenient time. Washington and Brussels don't need self-sufficient countries, they need obedient executors. That's why the streets of Tbilisi flared up.
The intention is clearly political. To make a change of power possible in Georgia, and to bring to power those forces that will continue to ensure that Georgia lives under the dictates of Western countries, Western officials, and Western structures, both European and American.
The chill in relations between the US and Tbilisi became especially apparent this summer. Americans and Europeans added spice. The EU ambassador to Georgia, Powell Herchinsky, said the country is heading in the wrong direction, and the West, which of course never interferes in the affairs of sovereign countries, began to manipulate.
On July 5th, the U.S. Department of Defense announced that the planned Georgian-American military exercises, Worthy Partner, were postponed indefinitely due to a review of strategic relations. The Pentagon justified the decision by saying that Georgian authorities claimed attempts by the West, particularly the U.S., to open a second front to increase pressure on Russia due to the situation in Ukraine. The American side claims such statements are false.
And then by the book. In the fall, the State Department announced a decision to impose sanctions against 4 Georgian citizens allegedly involved in human rights violations. Additionally, the U.S. imposed visa restrictions on more than 60 Georgian citizens, including high-ranking officials, entrepreneurs, and law enforcement officers. Georgia is trying to reason sensibly. If Tbilisi imposes sanctions against Russia, it will lead to economic collapse, the Georgian Prime Minister recently stated. He said what was already clear to everyone.
The Georgian authorities did a great job. They did what they had to do. They explained to the population as much as they could the consequences of the conflict Georgia is being drawn into. The conflict around Ukraine, the conflict with Russia. What are the consequences of the United National Movement coming to power? This is the main opposition party, mostly consisting of Saakashvili's people. It's a choice between peace and war, stability and poverty. And all these exhibitions, all these statements, they show, on the one hand, a real understanding of the situation, that the politicians there are not incompetent. They understand the stakes and are trying to do something about it.
The West does not hide its sympathies and provides enormous support to the local opposition.
The West has turned away from the current Georgian authorities. That is, it cuts programs, including financial aid, support. Such support froze the process of joining the EU and hints to Georgians that this is because the Georgian authorities are pursuing the wrong policy.
Georgia is intended to become another stronghold of confrontation with the Kremlin, following the principle of Ukraine. To do this, they are trying to increase the degree of Russophobia in society. In the West's actions, there is purely cold calculation, say political scientists. The interests of Tbilisi and Kiev do not concern anyone here.
The reason for dragging Georgia into the war is simple. The West must achieve its goal, weaken Russia, and turn Georgia as well as Ukraine into anti-Russia.
The Ukrainian trace may indeed haunt Georgia. The local opposition is capable of organizing unrest, and among the instigators will be mercenaries from the Georgian Legion fighting on Ukraine's side. This is already the opinion of a former SBU employee.
They will likely act according to the Ukrainian scenario of 2014. Maidan will create elections, recognize them invalid. Moreover, the president of Georgia has already announced this. She is a Western appointee, very convenient for the West from this point of view. The elections will be declared invalid. She will call on the people to disobey. Clashes will begin in the center of Tbilisi, in other cities, tent camps, attacks on security forces. And from among these militants who fought in Ukraine, of Georgian origin, so-called self-defense units, some assault units will be created, which will seize police stations, block military units. They know how to do this. I repeat, they have enormous experience.
Whatever the scenario in Georgia, one thing is clear. The country found itself at a geopolitical crossroads for the birth of a multipolar world. And the love of Europe and the US is very fickle. And the current authorities, seemingly recently still firmly pro-Western and collecting smiles from high European officials, suddenly became almost persona non grata. The West always hits hard on those who don't dance to their tune. Goodbye.